Simple garden tie-in wire like this. There's your snare. You can see what you've got here is a bolt hole. Critter comes, tries to come back. Just make a slight notch in the bark. Snare traps are probably the easiest traps to make. They're incredibly efficient, very effective. It's an excellent trap as a passive trap, and you can make large quantities of them very fast, very effectively, and carry them easily. You can see what you've got here is a bolt hole in this grass from a rabbit. It goes through this grass and underneath this iron fence. So this would be a perfect place. You put the end of your snare on the iron railing, and you would position your loop of the snare in that hole down there where the bolt hole is, making sure the loop is just big enough to get the rabbit's head with its ears back through the hole and about a fist off the ground. And that would be a perfect place to lay a snare. Snares can be made of just about any cordage or wire, provided it's strong enough to take the tension weight of the particular prey that you're after. Bearing in mind that the prey will be fighting for its life. Snares are not particularly humane. They don't tend to kill the animal straight away. Sometimes they do from choking, but often the animal's simply trapped. So whereby it's a passive trap, it's also one that has to be checked on at regular intervals. You can make snares, like I mentioned, out of just about anything. Natural cordage, synthetic cordage, but the two most common ways of making a snare are with wire or cable. Cable is the most efficient and strongest of all, especially if you buy the cable snares that have tension locks on them. So when the prey gets captured around the loop of the cable, as the whole of the cable tightens, it can't slip back on itself, making it more difficult for the animal to escape. But the most common way of creating a snare, purely for ease, availability and quickness of use, is with wire. By employing the right techniques, you can catch just about any size of prey with a snare, depending on the gauge of the material, but also the way in which it's laid. So what you've got here is a burrow and a clearly defined trail leading into the burrow with what I would suspect to be a rabbit. So you can see I've put my snare, I've lashed it to this incredibly strong tree and then adjusted the height about a fist off the ground and held it in the position I want using a small stick. And then I've put a little bit of debris to one side. And the animal will be used to coming out using the same path that it always makes anyway. But doing that just makes it a little bit more likely that it's not going to disturb the trap by going in at a different angle. It's going to follow the easiest route possible. Bearing in mind you are also disturbing the ground a little bit, and the critter will know that something's been there, it'll be a little bit more cautious. That said, if it's in there, it would have to come out, and in all probability if it was out foraging, it would have to go back to its den at some point. You also want to be taking measures to try and disguise your scent and the disturbance in the places that you're trapping. Now, trapping and making traps are two completely different subjects, and I'll go into the methodology of trapping in a separate video, because that's where the real skill of trapping comes into play. It's not actually about making the traps, it's about knowing where to place them and how to place them to maximise their impact. But that's a video further down the line. For the most part, snares are generally for small animals, so squirrels, rabbits, groundhogs, something in that kind of size category. They can, however, be sized up to catch bobcats, foxes. For those kind of snares you would use the cable snares. You can even capture deer. Now, it is possible to lay a snare in such a way that it goes round the head of a deer, for example, but the most common way of capturing a deer with a snare, or the most effective way, would be to employ a ground snare. So the foot of the animal, the hoof of the animal, goes into the hole and is captured by the snare, and when it lifts its leg out, it's then caught on the snare. Because the deer haven't got opposable thumbs to simply loosen themselves, they simply just keep tugging on it with their leg out of panic. If the snare is sufficiently tied down and strong enough, the deer won't be able to move. Again, I do stress, that's an incredibly inhumane way of capturing any animal, in my opinion. There are many instances of animals being captured in snares like that have literally ripped their own leg off trying to free themselves. Critter comes. Realises it can't go any further forward. Tries to come back. Now you can see no matter which direction it goes, it's going to be trapped. I just want to quickly say as well, I'm dismantling all the traps. This isn't actually a rabbit's burrow, it's just a likely looking place, and I gave it the impression that it looked like a burrow. No dog chews were harmed in the making of these videos. I'm just giving you the skills and the knowledge of how to construct these traps. The legalities and the moralities of using them are entirely down to you. Simple garden tie-in wire like this can be highly effective at making multiple snares. This kind of gauge of wire would be used for squirrels or rabbits, or even in some cases something as large as a beaver, but for the most part squirrels and rabbits. The length of the wire is dependent, but for the most part you want to keep it relatively short, because the more length of wire there is means that the prey has more opportunity to freely move, and if it's tugging on it, it may snap, or it may eventually relax and loosen itself from the trap. In some cases, if you're after squirrels, sometimes a slightly longer cable can be beneficial, because the animal will fall off the branch and hang. And if it's hanging far enough down from the branch, it isn't able to swing itself up and grab onto the branch again like a squirrel would be able to do. So I'll go for a couple of feet here. Take one end. Twist that into a loop. You want to have lots of twists so that it doesn't unravel itself. Feed the other end through the loop, There's your snare. You only want the loop of the snare to be just slightly bigger than the head of the animal that you're after. So that would be about what I would have for a rabbit. That's about what I would go for a grey squirrel. Squirrel traps are a little bit more difficult to deploy, but you know for a fact the squirrels are coming up here because you've seen them doing it. You've deployed the hole to the correct size of where the squirrel was passing through. Use the advantage of wire being able to hold its shape. So it's a lot easier to use wire than it is cordage, but it will still move around a little bit. So one thing you can do is make a slight notch in the bark to hold it in place. And that notch is just deep enough to allow the wire to sit in it. The hole can then be adjusted to fit the needs of the critter going through. I'm going to make the loop a little bit bigger because my demonstration critter is quite a bit bigger than the squirrel. So you can see with squirrels it's quite important to get a little bit of length on them. This will speed up the kill, but a squirrel will also frantically move around, and if it gets a purchase it'll just either prolong its suffering or eventually break the snare. If I was making a ground trap for the purposes of capturing the foot of an animal, same principle. That's about what I would make for a roe deer, and then the size will depend on the size of the animal. So you can see by putting the snare at the correct height with the correct size for the particular critter that you're after, it attempts to pass through the gap, but finds itself caught. And now it can't go backwards, can't go forwards. The more the animal struggles, the tighter the snare becomes. A ground snare principle works exactly the same way. You would dig a small hole, slightly larger than the diameter of the foot of the animal. Lay the snare hidden within the top half of the hole in the ground. The animal comes by, its foot drops into the hole, and it pulls up. But on pulling up, it now finds itself snared. Ground snares are not as effective as head snares, or leg snares aren't as effective as, say, head snares if you like, but they do work. The other end of the snare has to be well tied off. One method of doing this is to either have a peg that you can hammer into the ground. You can tie it off to a tree branch, or if you have a root or a tree nearby, a slightly smaller loop on one end. Here's your snare end. Simply wrap this round the tree, pass the snare end through. So this would be the tree, and then you set up your snare at this side, and then you can see it's like a two-ended snare but with one snaring itself to the anchor point. Of course, the great advantage of snares like this is they literally take seconds to make. With a pair of wire cutters and a spool of wire, you can make many hundreds of these in almost no time at all. And then to store them, you simply wind them up like so. You can imagine sitting on a night making hundreds of these, and then along a trap line or a perimeter of where you are, laying hundreds of these around bolt holes, animal trails, gaps in fences, gaps between trees, and it becomes a very effective passive trap. There's a great number of methodologies for setting snares, literally thousands of different setup techniques and innovative ways to deploy them. I'll cover some of those ways in another video. This video, I hope, just provided you with the very basics of how a snare is made and generally how they're used.